There are more than 20 burial mounds at the bottom of this lake. Nobody moved them, nobody dug them out. In 1950, the government built a dam, the water came up, and they were gone. And the ground they're resting on is the floor of a dead ocean. This is Cowan Lake, Clinton County, just outside of Wilmington, about 50 minutes northeast of Cincinnati. 700 acres of water with a state park wrapped around it. And on a summer weekend, it looks just like any other lake in Ohio. Pontoon boats, campers, and people fishing on the bank. This episode is about two things buried at Cowan Lake. One of them is 445 million years old, and you can hold it in your hand. The other is about 1,500 years old, and you'll never see it. Let's start with the one you can touch. On the north side of the dam, off Route 730, there's a pull-off. From there, a trail drops down to the spillway, and trail is generous. It's steep, it's loose, and mostly used by people carrying fishing poles. At the bottom, Cowan Creek comes off of the dam and runs over flat shelves of gray limestone. In every one of those shelves, every slab, every loose rock along the edge of that spillway is packed with fossils. Not if you're patient fossils, not bring a magnifying glass fossils. The rock down here is so full of dead sea creatures that in places it's hard to find a place without any. And here's why. 445 million years ago, this wasn't Ohio. It wasn't even the northern hemisphere. This part of the continent sat south of the equator, covered by warm, shallow, tropical sea. For millions of years, everything that lived and died in that sea sank to the bottom. Shells, coral, entire reef systems piling up layer after layer until the weight of it compressed into limestone. Then, ages later, the same forces that pushed up the Appalachian Mountains flexed this part of the continent up into a bulge geologists call the Cincinnati Arch. Erosion has been peeling away the layers ever since. That's why Southwest Ohio is one of the most famous places on the planet to find fossils of the Ordovician period. Paleontologists travel here from around the world for what's lying on the ground. And some of the best hunting is at the bottom of the dam spillways, because when the engineers blasted these channels out of the bedrock, they did the digging for everybody. So what did we find? Brachiopods by the dozens, little ridged shells that look like clams but are not clams. Horn corals, which look exactly like what they're called. Stony horns, each one a single animal that spent its whole life anchored to the seafloor. Bryozoans, colonies of tiny animals that grew in branching fan-like patterns, like coral during an impression of moss. And crinoid stems, small stacked discs that were once the stalks of sea lilies, which were animals, not flowers. Nothing from this period is what it looked like. What we haven't found yet is a trilobite. They're down here. Ohio's official state fossil is a trilobite, but some of the rocks we brought home have dozens of fossils crammed into a few square inches. So there's a real chance there's one hiding in the pile, and we just haven't spotted it yet. If you happen to spot one in any of the footage, let me know in the comments. One warning if you come down here, the water is full of snakes. They're not water moccasins, they don't live in Ohio at all. What's actually in the spillway is the northern water snake, which is non-venomous, though famously bad-tempered. I'd still give them room anyway. And check with the park office on collecting rules before you fill your pockets. The rules vary from park to park in Ohio, and they change. The fossils have been here for 445 million years. They'll survive one more phone call. One more thing about these animals and these rocks, their world didn't fade out. It ended. Around 443 million years ago, the Ordovician period closed, with the first mass extinction in Earth's history. The planet cooled hard, sea levels crashed, and something like 85% of marine species disappeared. The reef world in that spillway is just a snapshot of an ocean that got shut off. You're picking up pieces of it off the ground an hour outside of Cincinnati. But now the other thing that's buried here. Long before there was a lake, there was a valley at Cowan Creek, and the people living in this region built mounds. The Adena, the earliest of Ohio's mound building cultures. Along this creek, surveys recorded more than 20 burial mounds, plus a circular earthwork enclosure about 90 feet across. Those mounds stood in this valley for centuries. They outlasted the culture that built them. They outlasted settlement and farming and everything else Ohio threw at the landscape. Then, starting in 1946, the state of Ohio began buying up the land along the Cowan Creek to build a lake. By the spring of 1949, the dam was essentially finished and the water was coming. That April, Raymond Beebe, the curator of archaeology for the Ohio Historical Society, came down with a colleague, Robert Goslin, to salvage whatever they could before the valley flooded. Out of more than 20 mounds, they had time to properly excavate one, and what they found under it wasn't just a burial. When they peeled the mound away, underneath it was a footprint of a building, a circle of paired postals 45 feet across, with fragments of charred bark that had likely been a roof, a pattern archaeologists have found buried beneath Adena mounds across the Ohio Valley. These weren't piles of dirt dumped out over a grave. They were monuments, raised over structures, like large ceremonial buildings. They were used and taken down or burned and then buried. On the floor of that structure, the excavators found a pile of goosefoot seeds, a few charred fragments of squash rind sitting in the remains of a woven container. Somebody's harvest, carbonized in place, waiting there for 1,500 years. The charcoal from this site also ended up in scientific history. Radiocarbon dating had just been invented, and the entire technique was only a few years old, and a sample from Cowan Creek Mound was running through it. The date was published in the Journal of Science in 1951, co-authored by Willard Libby, the man who invented the method. The result? The mound went up around 500 CE. That makes it one of the youngest Adena mounds ever dated. The closing chapter of a culture that had been building in Ohio for well over 1,000 years. Beebe never published a full report of the excavation. In 1950, before anyone could get the rest, the dam closed, the valley filled, and Cowan Lake rose up over all of it. The mounds are still under there, under the boats, under the swimmers, under the bass fishermen who have been drifting over them for 75 years. One piece of the complex survived above the waterline, the circular enclosure. It sits on a peninsula in the lake, about 300 feet from where the excavated mound went under. It's been on the National Register of Historic Places since 1974, and you can't see it. Even back in 1949, it had almost no height left. The only way to make out its shape was from an airplane. The park's approach has been to leave it completely alone and let the land grow back over it. So it's out there right now, protected, intact, and invisible. Given how things went for every other earthwork in the valleys of Ohio, invisible might be the safest thing for an ancient monument here. So that's Cowan Lake. On one side of the dam, the floor of a tropical ocean, older than fish with jaws. On the other side, a drowned, sacred landscape nobody got to study. And in between, 700 acres of people having a perfectly nice Saturday with no idea about either one. If you want more of the history behind any of this, you can find it over at my website, thebeardedvagabond.com. Links in the description. Next one, Cedar Creek, 20 minutes up the road. When the Army Corps of Engineers built that dam, they blasted an emergency spillway out of the same Ordovician bedrock and accidentally created one of the best public fossil hunting sites in the country. Subscribe if you want to see it. I'm Rex. That's Artemis. I'll see you on the next one.
You're such a good girl.